So this is a paper that Eric and I wrote on quadratic election law. And by this term, we generally mean the intersection of quadratic voting and election law. And we more specifically mean what is the lawfulness of quadratic voting and what are the implications of quadratic voting for different subfields of election law. There's four main things I'll talk about today. The first of them is the constitutionality of pure quadratic voting involving money. The short answer is that pure QV is almost certainly unconstitutional, which is probably not a surprise to anyone who's thought about that problem. Then I'll present a modified alternative to pure QV that Eric and I lay out in our paper. The crux of this alternative is that equal credits would be allocated to voters, but there wouldn't be any actual money involved in the system. Then third, I'll talk about the constitutionality of this alternative to pure QV. It's likely, although still not certainly constitutional. And then fourth, and this is the largest part of the presentation, I'll talk about what the implications of modified QV are for a series of election law areas. And I'll talk about redistricting, the Voting Rights Act, and campaign finance. We cover a couple additional areas in the paper, but I'll skip those for present purposes. OK, so let me start with what's sort of the primary legal question here, which is what is the constitutionality of pure quadratic voting, you know, the mechanism that we've largely been discussing until now in the conference. And there are three constitutional doctrines, all under the 14th Amendment, that seem relevant to assessing the constitutionality of pure QV. The first of these is the 24th Amendment and Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections. Together, they stand for the principle that poll taxes are unconstitutional, and it's also unconstitutional to link voting in some way to people's ability to pay. There's a quote from Harper where the court says that a state violates the Equal Protection Clause whenever it makes the affluence of the voter or payment of any fee an electoral standard. So it's reasonably clear that pure QV is unconstitutional under Harper and the 24th Amendment. It does link electoral influence and voting to a voter's ability to pay some amount of money. It does differentiate to some degree between those that have a greater ability to pay and a lesser ability to pay. We shouldn't overstate this point. You know, the price of quadratic voting goes up really quickly if you want to buy a lot of votes. And the pro rata redistribution aspect of the system can actually make many less well-off people net beneficiaries under the system. But I think the constitutional point still stands. The ability to pay is made relevant to voting under pure QV, and that's not a permissible linkage under Harper and the 24th Amendment. The second relevant line of doctrine is the one person, one vote rule that originated in cases in the 1960s. One person, one vote says that people's votes have to be counted equally. It's impermissible for the government to value one person's vote more than another person's vote. There's a line from Reynolds v. Sims, the foundational one person, one vote case, where the court says that it is inconceivable that certain of the state's voters could vote 2, 5, or 10 times for their legislative representatives, while voters living elsewhere could vote only once. So basically what Reynolds said was constitutionally inconceivable is what would be required under pure quadratic voting. You know, almost by definition, you would have certain people people with stronger preferences and a greater ability to pay casting more votes than other people with less intense preferences and less of an ability to pay. So I think that's also, on its face, a pretty obvious constitutional violation. Then the third relevant line of doctrine is the so-called Anderson-Burdick balancing. This is the default system that the court uses to generally assess regulations of the franchise or measures that impose some sort of burden on voting. The basic way that this system works is that the more severe the burden that's imposed on the franchise, the stricter the scrutiny is that the court applies. And this is often referred to as sliding scale scrutiny. So under this approach, I think the constitutionality of pure QV is actually uncertain. Maybe there's even, maybe the positive case is actually better than the negative case. So it's likely that pure QV would be deemed to impose a pretty severe burden on voters. That's because under pure QV, certain voters won't be able to cast as many votes as they would like, simply because of a factor that the courts consider irrelevant and arbitrary, which is the ability to pay. So you have a severe burden, but that's not the end of the story. You then have to ask, can the measure or can the policy nevertheless survive strict scrutiny? And here the answer is maybe. So it does serve the compelling purpose of welfare maximization, improving collective decision making. And I think that's on its face a very compelling state interest. And it's also likely the case that pure QV is narrowly tailored to accomplish that compelling interest. Certainly, there are no other obvious alternatives to pure QV, no other voting systems that would pursue or further this interest to the same degree. So I think it's actually quite plausible that pure QV survives scrutiny under Anderson-Burdick balancing. However, it doesn't really matter because for constitutional law purposes, one strike is enough, and here we have two strikes. So the fact that pure QV is not also unlawful under a third line of doctrine, I think is largely immaterial. Okay, so since pure QV is unconstitutional, Eric and I came up with a modified alternative to pure QV that tries to avoid the constitutional problems that I laid out. This is not really a new idea. This is essentially the same thing that Eric and Glenn proposed in their earlier work. And the basic idea here is to get rid of money in the system altogether and instead to allocate the exact same number of credits to every voter. And you could allocate these credits in a single lump sum payment, for example, when a voter turns 18, or you could have a system where every X years the voter gets an additional infusion of Y credits. The key is just that the perfect equality of voters is preserved because every voter is getting the exact same number of credits. And then the voters would convert these credits on a quadratic basis into votes for different candidates. So as we envision the system, this would allow voters to make trade-offs among different races that are held at the same time. So you go to the polls and you allocate your credits as you see fit between the presidential race, the senatorial race, the US House race, et cetera. But the system would also allow for intertemporal trade-offs. So you could save your credits and decide that this election as a whole is not very important to you, but there's a good chance that an election in a few years will be one about which you'll feel more strongly, so you could reserve your credits for that future election. So this means that a certain kind of trade-off is available under modified QV, but it's only a trade-off among different electoral races. Because money is no longer part of this system, trade-offs between public and private goods are no longer possible. And this obviously substantially reduces the potency of the system. We think that's the price that has to be paid if the system is going to be made lawful. And because there's no money involved in the system, then there's also no pro rata distribution of funds. I suppose you could envision a pro rata distribution of credits, but that's a little twist that we haven't actually thought about. OK, so modified QV, does it actually solve the constitutional problems that I mentioned before? I'll run through the same 3 lines of precedent. So first off, I think that it's pretty clear that there's no 24th Amendment problem with modified QV, and there's no problem under Harper. And that's because now the system doesn't differentiate in any way based on someone's ability to pay. No one has to pay a cent under modified QV to participate in voting. And there's no differentiation anymore between the wealthy and the less affluent. I think it's also quite likely that modified QV is perfectly valid under the sort of default Anderson-Burdick balancing that applies to most electoral regulations. That's because the burden imposed by modified QV is fairly light. I think it's similar to the burden that just about any electoral system places. It's permissible to structure, to organize the process of choosing candidates in a certain way. And that's all that modified QV does in this system. So that means that a lesser degree of scrutiny applies to modified QV. And I think it's likely that it satisfies this lower level of scrutiny. So it's still serving the very important goal of improving collective decision-making. And if pure QV is off the table as unconstitutional, then it's likely that there's no better tailored way to promote that goal than this modified system. And even if it's not the least restrictive means, it's at least a very intuitive and quite well-tailored means to promoting effective decision-making. However, the constitutionality of modified QV is not quite so clear under the one person, one vote doctrine. So here, it is clear that voters are treated equally in the aggregate. So every voter gets the same number of lifetime credits. So from the perspective of the voter overall, there is perfect equality here. The trouble is that there is not perfect equality if we switch our perspective to the individual race. So because voters will have allocated their credits in the past in different ways, that's going to leave them differently positioned in any current particular race that we're focusing our attention on. So whether this policy complies with the one person, one vote rule really hinges on whether we are requiring voter equality at the sort of wholesale aggregate level or at the more retail particular level of the individual race. And not surprisingly, because current doctrine has never grappled with this question of what's the right level at which to assess equality, we can't really find any answers in the current constitutional case law. It is worth noting here that there are a couple sort of cousin related policies of modified QV that the courts have held are valid under one person, one vote. So the courts have held that cumulative voting is constitutional because every voter gets the same number of votes to distribute. Courts have also held that instant runoff voting is constitutional because every voter has the same opportunity to rank candidates in the voters' order of preference. So those precedents aren't exactly on point because they don't involve this issue of different levels of equality, but they're at least moderately suggestive, and they hint that courts would be receptive to upholding some kind of system along these lines. All right, so let's assume that modified QV is constitutional. The next interesting question is what would the legal implications of the policy be for various legal subfields? And I'll talk now about three major subfields of election law: redistricting, the Voting Rights Act, and campaign finance. We also cover political party primaries in the paper, as well as restrictions on the franchise. But I'll bracket those topics now unless there's interest in discussing them later. OK, so let's start with redistricting. So the main current problem with redistricting is the practice of partisan gerrymandering. This is just the practice where a given party will manipulate district boundaries in order to help that party's candidates and harm the opposing party's candidates. As I've shown in some other work, the current level of partisan gerrymandering in the United States at both the congressional and state legislative levels is at a high, at least in the modern post-one-person, one-vote revolution period. So this is a large and growing problem. Now, gerrymandering hinges on the ability of the line drawer to accurately predict how districts are going to perform. So there are two classic techniques of gerrymandering, cracking and packing. And both of those require accurate information about how the districts are going to operate. So for example, if a line drawer cracks a bunch of opposing party voters into a number of districts where it's hoped that those voters are going to lose every race by a relatively small margin, the line drawer has to make really sure that those voters actually stay cracked and lose. It defeats the whole purpose of the gerrymander if the cracked voters accidentally win the race. Similarly with the technique of packing, where a line drawer puts as many voters of the other side as possible into a district so they win by a huge margin, the line drawer really wants to make sure that the margin of victory actually is very big. It's totally counterproductive for the line drawer if, in fact, the nominally packed voters end up winning that district by a small margin. So the way that modified QV intersects with sort of redistricting theory is that it makes it much more difficult to predict how a given district will perform over its lifespan. And this is basically because under the status quo, all you really need to predict the district's performance is the district's partisan composition. On the other hand, under QV, you also need to have a sense of the relative preference intensities of the different parties' voters. And I guess also the different parties' voters' estimates of their own pivotality in the election. And both of those quantities are a lot harder to determine ex ante, and they're a lot more likely to shift from one election to the next. Obvious example, take a district that's 55% Republican, 45% Democratic. That's a fairly safe Republican district under the status quo, under most plausible shifts in the electoral environment. But under QV, this is not a reliable district at all. If Democrats are a bit more enthusiastic, or if Democrats are a bit more optimistic about the odds of them being pivotal, then it's not hard at all to imagine that this district actually comes out the other way. Conversely, it's also not hard to imagine a district that's supposed to be a narrow Republican win ending up as an overwhelming Republican win. It could be Republicans who feel more intensely and who overestimate their odds of pivotality. So a district that was meant to be cracked could actually end up being inefficiently packed with Republicans, depending on how exactly the calculus plays out. So these aspects of QV I don't think would eliminate partisan gerrymandering, but they would substantially curb it. And that's because they would take off the table the most finely tuned, precisely crafted districts for accomplishing gerrymandering. So, could you still gerrymander under QV? Sure, but not with 55-45 districts. Maybe you'd have to pack the other side 95-5 or 90-10 to be really sure they're going to stay packed, even given shifts in preference intensity and assessments of pivotality. To crack the other side, maybe you crack them 65-35 or 70-30 to make sure they don't accidentally win that district. So that still permits some gerrymandering, but much, much less than we see under the status quo, where voter behavior is much more predictable. All right, next let me turn to the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act does a lot of things, but the one thing I'll touch on here is that it bans the practice of racial vote dilution. Racial vote dilution refers to measures that reduce the electoral influence of minority voters without disenfranchising those voters altogether. And one classic example of vote dilution is an at-large electoral system in a jurisdiction that has a white majority and a sizable minority population. In that case, the at-large system enables the white majority to win basically every seat in the jurisdiction. Another classic example of vote dilution is in a regular single-member district plan to pack and crack minority voters so that they're able to elect fewer of their preferred candidates than would be possible under some other configuration of the districts. So the classic Voting Rights Act remedy for vote dilution is the majority-minority district. So a single-member district that's deliberately designed to have a majority of minority voters. However, majority-minority districts are highly controversial because they're so explicitly race-conscious. They're districts that are drawn with a particular motive and often with very weird shapes of having a local minority serve as the majority. So here, modified QV at least holds out the hope that you might be able to get descriptive representation for minority voters without the need for these controversial majority-minority districts. The idea is that if minority voters feel more strongly or have more intense preferences than members of the white majority, they'll be able to elect their preferred candidate even in districts that aren't majority-minority districts. So you can have a 45%, a 40% minority district that relies on the greater intensity of preference of the minority voters to elect the minority preferred candidate. Of course, that's the sunny side. The other possibility is that the voter preferences line up in a different way. And in fact, minority voters have equally intense preferences or less intense preferences than members of the white majority. And if that's how the preferences line up, then QV would actually have the opposite consequences, and it would destabilize existing majority-minority districts. You take a district that's currently 55% minority, quite likely under conditions of racial polarization in voting, to elect the minority preferred candidate. But under QV, if minority voters are less intense than the majority voters, there's no guarantee at all about who this 55% minority district will elect. It could likely be a member of the majority racial group. And the point here, I think, is that this example combined with the redistricting discussion shows you that there's greater uncertainty under QV whether your motives in redistricting are purportedly benign or purportedly malign. So QV makes pernicious things like partisan gerrymandering more difficult, but it also makes nominally benign things like districting to ensure minority representation more difficult too. Like basically whatever you want to do with district lines becomes harder to do if it's a lot more difficult to anticipate how these different districts are going to perform. I'll mention one more VRA point here that's not on the slide, which is that reformers in this area very often advocate remedies involving multi-member districts. And it's not hard to imagine pairing QV with a multi-member district in a way that would enable minority representation without having to resort to the practice of crafting the finely wrought majority-minority districts. You would basically have a district that has a sizable minority group and a white majority, and you would allow the voters to then elect multiple candidates using QV. And the expectation would be that if the minority voters feel strongly and if they allocate their votes to one or more minority candidates, then they'll be able to guarantee the election of minority candidates without needing the single-member majority-minority districts. I see my time is almost up, so I'll run quickly through the final area of campaign finance. So campaign finance, there's two different kinds of implications that QV can have here. One of them, let's take our current campaign finance policies as a given. QV might still have consequences for how campaigns and candidates choose to allocate their campaign funds. So at present, a lot of campaign energy, not all of it, but a lot of it goes into trying to persuade swing voters in the middle of the distribution to support a candidate. This becomes a less useful activity under QV, at least if we assume that voters in the middle are unlikely to be able to be swayed significantly in either direction, and so are not going to be able or not going to be willing to cast a lot more votes for a candidate regardless of what the candidate does. You instead might expect campaigns under QV to focus their energies on the voters whose intensity of preference could shift the most. That would likely be base voters on both sides. Maybe you could inspire the base voters on your side to get really animated and to cast a lot more votes for your candidate. Or maybe you could discourage voters on the other side and prompt them to cast many fewer votes for their preferred candidate. The key would be to figure out who are the most likely voters to shift quite a lot in response to campaign activity and focus the campaign efforts on those people. So that's if we hold current campaign finance policy constant. Another option is to try to apply QV ideas to our existing campaign finance policies. There are a lot of ways that could be done. I'll just mention one of them right now. That would be to place a quadratic tax on campaign contributions along with a multiple that's set in such a way that the whole system ends up being budget neutral. So let's say that a multiple of 10 gave you budget equality. Then if I give a dollar to a candidate, the candidate gets the square root of that dollar times the multiple. So my $1 becomes $10. Obviously, with the multiple being 10, the break-even point will be at $100. So a $100 contribution results in $100 going to the candidate. And then larger contributions actually end up being taxed substantially. So a $10,000 contribution, the square root of that is $100 times 10 is 1,000. The other $9,000 would then go to the public treasury. So in this way, this would basically amount to public financing for smaller contributions, fully paid for by a quadratic tax on larger contributions. So it sort of merges, I think quite elegantly, both contribution limits and public financing and support for smaller donors. Last point, then I'll stop. Would this system be constitutional? I think maybe. So, the burden it imposes on speech is arguably less than the current system of outright contribution ceilings. So with a quadratic tax, you can donate as much as you want, only the amount of the tax escalates as you give more. However, the interest being served by this system is no longer the prevention of corruption, which is the one interest that the court has acknowledged in the campaign finance context. Instead, the interest is promoting more effective collective decision making. That seems pretty compelling to me, but the current court has been extremely reticent to recognize any new interests in the campaign finance context. There's the additional twist here that this kind of a system promotes the efficient donation of funds. It helps to make the marginal benefit and marginal cost of donating equal. However, money is one step removed from the actual unit of decision, which remains as votes. So because there's this additional gulf between the quantity being regulated here and the actual decision-making unit, it's a bit unclear to what extent you're actually promoting collective decision-making through this system. But I think it's still an intriguing idea of at least plausible constitutionality, maybe even more so if the current court shifts just a little bit, as it seems like it might. So OK, I'll stop there, and Eric and I look forward to your questions. And there are a lot of questions. All right, sure.
So I have a couple, and both relate to the nature of the modified scheme. And basically, I like all of what you're doing with it, and I encourage you to do more, and let me elaborate what I mean. So in the latter half, where you're talking about redistricting and Voting Rights Act and gerrymandering and all these things, all of your arguments were phrased as if we were in an unmodified scheme. Now, I think there are modified and more subtle versions of the modified scheme, but I think you need to move there. So, like, are the minorities more intense than X will happen? Well, if the minorities have a fixed pot, that's a non sequitur. They can be more intense in this election versus next year's election, or for the mayor versus the city council member. And if they try harder to get their city council member, they're less likely to get the mayor because they have a fixed pot. So I just think you need more, and all of those, I think you need more nuanced versions that reflect the character of the modified scheme. They're similar arguments, but I just think they need adjustments. Going back on the crafting of the modified scheme, the particular element I wanted to focus on, which you attend to, and again, I'm going to just encourage it more, is sort of the time and election and race cluster. So if you go across a lot of elections, it seems, in a lot of time, it seems you have additional problems. So there are multiple jurisdictions in which you vote, people move over time. If you leave a local jurisdiction and move to a different one, but you already spent your 10-year allotment in the first one, but wait, which of those credits did you spend? Because they were pooled with the state and the federal credits and the referendum credits. So I think that there are a lot of forces which might push you toward an election cycle budget or something like that when one works that part out, sort of just a thought. There's also some interesting strategic dynamic aspects. So some of yesterday's discussion on agenda setting, you give people a fixed pot. If someone can get either a candidate or a referendum on the ballot because one group to use up a lot of their chips, then in the next 5 elections, they've got like nothing left. And one can, do various things even if they have intense preferences in the next election. And there's other interesting smaller timing things. So let's just take one election cycle and one election for president. We also have a primary. Do I vote in the primary or do I vote in the election, not yet knowing who's going to be on the ballot of the election? It's very interesting strategic grip. I haven't thought through it all, but I think that in thinking of how big is the budget and then what strategic things does that create in it, there's just more development to do. It's not a disagreement with anything, but just some thoughts as to where one might push further to see how they work out.
Yeah, those are all good suggestions.
Yeah, and I think Eric and I, we were not trying to fully flesh out how the policy. I mean, I think if you were trying to actually implement this, the different levels of government in particular is a very major complication. So
I do separate buckets on each, but then that narrows the trading law.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so forth.
For the minorities, I was imagining most minority voters probably live in some majority minority constituencies, but not in others. So maybe they would.
It doesn't matter, but for city council it does.
Yeah, or like I live in a majority minority House district, but my state where I vote for Senate is majority white. So maybe I'll allocate more of my votes to the race where I can actually elect a preferred member of my own group. Sure.
Along the same lines, I'm kind of worried about the neglect of local elections. So it's like most people get much more excited about a presidential election than other elections, and that shows up in turnout. But I think it would show up in a big way with the use of these credits. And so I think you'd have very, very small numbers of people who would really be determining the local and state elections. And I think there's some issues with that. And I mean, it's a little related to this other issue of what information people have. It's like people are, on one hand, people are more likely to vote on something they feel that they understand, but already you have, of course you have manipulation like this now where you have an election that's only on one referendum that only a few people really care about, and so you get the school bond election on an off election where only the teachers go and vote and stuff. So it's not an unknown kind of problem, but I think you'd have more of this kind of. But it's almost like the gerrymandering, but for these local elections. You get these people who have total control of the local elections, and most people would only be using their votes for the presidential election, maybe their senator or something.
There's an offsetting consideration, which is that your chance of being pivotal in a presidential election is tiny. Now, I know Lewis's paper makes some good points about this, but while you're in the voting booth, you might think, well, I might actually affect the alderman election.
I think people have enough illusions about this that.
Yeah. Well, if they do, then the whole thing's off the table.
And this is also a familiar problem under the status quo, and I think also under a pure QV system, right? Like under pure QV, people might choose to spend very few dollars in the local elections, and again, the motivated fraction of the people might be able to dominate that election with their dollars as opposed to their chits. And under the status quo too, we see lots of localities quite on purpose hold their elections in March in odd years. So basically no one participates. It's partially true, right? I see David shaking his head, but are those, what's that? Yeah, we certainly would never do that in Chicago, right?
There's over 110% turnout whenever you vote.
Yes, I have 2 points, one of which was partially anticipated by Lewis. Your point on gerrymandering, I think it's quite clearly true that the variability of any particular election would be increased. But over a cycle, over 10 years of elections, it's still true that 55% of the credits go to Democrats and 45% to Republicans. And so in fact, I think if you're drawing districts for more than one election, it's not going to change your gerrymandering incentives one bit. And the second point is, I think if you think of it like as a control theory thing, it's pretty clear that this system is going to produce oscillations. And those can then be strategically manipulated, as Lewis said, because people don't know what's coming, and they're perfectly rational. They'll tend to overspend this time and be left short, and that's the source of the oscillations, which you can then exploit to exacerbate the oscillations. So I think you've introduced a new dynamic problem.
So I think it's right that when it comes to redistricting, the main effect would not be to change the mean in any district, but to just expand the variance around that mean. But a major thing that line drawers currently try to do is to eliminate or to minimize that uncertainty. they really want to make sure that they don't win a district 3 out of 5 times, that they want to win it 5 out of 5 times, because the turnover means, you know, an incumbent is lost, another party's incumbent might start to get entrenched. So, you know, even if all we do is keep the same mean performance over a decade, but just you know, double or triple the standard deviation around that mean, that in itself, I think, would be a very positive dynamic for gerrymandering. It would sort of shake up the whole system a lot more every race than happens now.
They'd be much more convex.
Yeah, and I take the point about the oscillations getting bigger. People might then spend now because they know there's about an oscillation about to happen. Yeah, I think that Lewis also made that point. I think that's right. I don't think we fully thought through that, but yeah. Sure.
So I want to make I think this is all incredibly interesting and has many attractive features, and I want to make a plea for you stopping looking at it as a second best, because actually I'm not sure it is, and here's why. First of all, you started off by saying QV maximizes welfare, but QV doesn't maximize welfare because of the decreasing marginal utility of wealth. So it ends up weighting the preferences of the wealthy more than the preferences of the poor for the same intensity level. So that's now what your modified version does is it treats everyone's total preference package as being the same intensity. And then but you know, keeps the relative levels. It expresses the relative levels, say between different candidate elections with it. And normatively, that doesn't seem to me less attractive necessarily. It might be a better way to think about the relation of preferences to democratic procedures. I'm not sure, but so I think the comparison is more ambiguous to start with. And now, I think when it comes to redistricting and minority segments, I feel like your modified version might do better. Here's why. It's true it would be harder, but you could gerrymander districts based on, I think, essentially just 2 variables. Now it's just 1, but you'll need 2 under straight QV. Partisan identification and wealth. I mean, look, suppose you knew, and this is not hard to imagine at all, that a wealthier neighborhood would cast literally twice as many votes in pretty much every election. It's very easy to imagine that. Then it would be, you would allow all kinds of possibilities of gerrymandering with, even you could get smaller, you get a minority white district that only elected white candidates. I mean, it would be, in a way, it could go on steroids. It would be hard, maybe, but you could get these things going. And whereas this version doesn't have any of those features, it beautifully breaks things up, just like you're saying. I mean, these were a lot of good points expressed, but I mean, I think there are a lot of advantages here. Just what do you think about that?
One thing I would say, you know, I agree with your argument in your paper that you can't just sort of assume that the pure quadratic voting would maximize a utilitarian social welfare function. But there are a lot of steps that you guys you know, don't go into, but which are relevant. For example, the redistribution aspect. And also, you have to ask yourself, you know, what social welfare system would people choose under a system of quadratic voting relative to the social welfare system that they would choose under a system of one person, one vote? Which one gets us closer to welfare maximization? But so we're in this kind of world of second best, where but then I generally agree with your points, and certainly Nick didn't go into this so much, but the way courts think about this, which they don't think about this problem in utilitarian terms, but in terms of these kind of mushy legal categories, or
Yeah.
highly refined philosophy.
The Constitution is really wise.
It's very.
Yeah.
I agree that the modified version would seem much more appealing based on those values, which reflect democratic values of some sort. So I think that's right. And I think your second point is also right, although we should think more about it, because a lot of these things are a little more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same reaction. You know, if we're valuing goals other than efficiency, there's all sorts of reasons to think that modified QV might be just outright preferable to pure QV. You know, I guess maybe I was too
We shouldn't
influenced.
have said
Maybe I was too influenced by Eric in writing this paper, and so we erroneously prioritized one value over others. Glenn?
Modified QB is efficient too. So, and what you said about not being able to bring in private goods is not really true, because there are a lot of public policies that take money and give it to people or take it away. I mean, tax policy, social welfare functions, and so I mean, with the fake credits, it's very, very close to this normalized gradient addition mechanism. They're in the same category, and that's pretty optimal. So it's just not true that you're not efficient when you do the credits. I mean, that's really a matter of what's within the scope of public policy. So yes, if certain things are ruled out of the scope of public policy, you don't have efficiency over those. But within the scope of all the things included in public policy, you have full-scale efficiency with the normalized gradient addition mechanism, which is very, very close to this modified QB.
Glenn?
I'm just going to say two things. So first of all, getting back to Ben Wise's point and some of the things that you were saying about like how hard it is to gerrymander, I think one really important point is that it also affects how bad the effects of gerrymandering are. Because the thing is, if you have a district that is close now, it's going to be very hard to put someone who's like David Duke in there. Whereas it might be possible to do that in like, a slight majority Republican thing. Because if there's strong opposition to someone, and then if there's an endogenous response and you run candidates who cater to the new system, I actually think an even more important thing than whether or not you gerrymander is the way that endogenously it moderates the bad consequences that gerrymandering leads to in terms of the types of candidates who get elected, and improves the quality of the candidates on the other side. So in that sense, I think that's maybe even a larger effect than whether it's possible or not. And the second thing I was going to suggest, which just occurred to me, is imagine that rather than using currency, there was something like time, which is like more or less equally distributed across wealth levels, that people could invest in order to obtain votes. I don't know what the constitutional status of that would be, but it's a potential way of thinking about, like you could do some social service or something like this, or
This is done on American Idol. You dial again and again and again to vote more times for
I
your
mean,
candidate.
that's wasteful, but I mean, the thing is, like, imagine, there was some, it could be military service or public service, and the more of this you did, the more, credits you got access to. I mean, I don't know if that's desirable or not necessarily, but it might be a more egalitarian way of allowing for some non-wealth-based trade between private goods and public goods.
The longer you stand in line, the more votes you get. Although currently, it's exactly the poor who often have to stand in line the longest to vote. So that'd be a nice twist. On the first points, I think you're largely bringing up the separate value of sort of electoral competitiveness, and how greater electoral competitiveness might have an effect on moderating the ideology or the voting records of representatives. Certainly plausible. Currently, there's only an extremely weak relationship between district competitiveness and the extremism of the representative of the district. So, if you look at the representatives of the least competitive districts, they're just about the same in their ideological extremism as representatives from the most competitive districts. And that's because the pull of partisan forces within the legislature, the pull of partisan activists, the pull of the campaign finance system is substantially greater than the electoral incentive. And so that ends up polarizing everybody, including people from competitive races. I still agree that if there's suddenly triple the risk of losing your next race, maybe everyone starts behaving like Scott Brown, and you start getting some real moderates. But
I'm saying something slightly different, which is that to win, you now need to get people that are not too intensely opposed to you. So it's not actually competitiveness, not how close it is, but what is the standard for winning. And so if you run David Duke in a 51% white district, maybe the 51% of white people would vote for him. But maybe they're not nearly as intense as the African Americans who would oppose him. And so, that's sort of the thought, but.
Yep.
So one thing is not obvious to me that what you should do is have sort of a one-for-one exchange across different elections. So the price should be quadratic within an election, but pivotality might be different because, say, of the size of the electorate, you know, if you're voting locally, say, as opposed to a national election or something like that. And so it's not, you might want to make some kind of correction.
Although wouldn't you correct for that just by casting more or less votes? Like isn't the same thing as with dollars, where you know you would change what you spend based on the the product of utility and pivotality?
Well, so, and I guess what's not clear to me is that the result about QV is that you're going to be efficient within an election. It's not obvious. Is it obvious that?
So that thing in a rational equilibrium, which who knows whether we would play that, but in a rational equilibrium, what you're saying should make no difference to the equilibrium, even with artificial currency.
No,
But
if you have artificial currency that's only good for voting on one candidate, that's equivalent to majority vote because you're going to spend it all because it's worthless elsewhere. So you have to have some trade-offs.
of course.
It can't.
He's just saying changing the price.
Election, you got to have more
Miles,
than one thing
he's
you're
saying
voting
changing
over.
the price, but changing the multiplier on the price on an individual race should not change the equilibrium under the perfectly rational model, but it could under other models.
David?
I have a similar question, which is if you have a fixed pool of votes, I don't quite understand how, when you get near the end of that pool or something, how the incentives of modified QV play out. Are you really going to think about it being a marginal preference or marginal cost there? I think if you can't trade off consumption, you're assuming you can trade off consumption via other policies.
Well, if you can't trade it off, then it's just majority voting. And
Well, no, but if it's multiple,
I'm going to lose these. It's use it or lose it now.
well,
I'm
it's
just going to vote
multiple.
them all.
It's multiple elections, so there's some trade-offs, right?
But you have to
it's-
have you have to have it rolling so that
Right.
it's maybe they expire. But what you can't have is for this block of time I have them because then near the end of the time it becomes majority vote.
Well,
You have to have them.
that's interesting. So
Yeah.
if they have it even if you have your lifetime, you can't trade off consumption, right? So at some point you've got a fixed pool of votes you got to use up.
Yeah.
It could be even worse. It could be that toward the end you're out of votes, and so you're disenfranchised in a certain set of elections.
It's not going to be the same
Yeah.
as straight TV. If you can't trade off of an automobile or a movie.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you can imagine fixes for that. Like you could use your extra votes to buy
But
something.
then it's money.
from the
Then you're just
state.
handing out money to people, right?
Well, no, yeah, it's true. It's true. Or maybe there would be. I guess if they did it, if it was for your lifetime, or if there's some way of renewing by paying a price.
Right. Especially you got to work out the
You got to work that stuff out. I agree. Yeah.
But is there any strategic advantage for parties to in fact run David Dukes in order to pull out a whole lot of votes with the plan that in the next election cycle, their opponents having used up all of their votes on that, they'll be able to run somebody who's just a little bit more acceptable than David Duke and still get into a...
Yeah, I was thinking of just this while Nick was speaking, and I wish I'd been in the position to ask him the question, but it occurred to me, yes, that you've got the party control, and that the parties could effectively engage in colluding, within themselves across their own candidates. So that would have to be another thing to address. I haven't thought about it, but
I guess one quick thought is that really hinges on the party knowing that the other side's voters are going to feel more intensely and waste all their votes, whereas our side's voters will know better and they'll know to stockpile their votes and wait for the future. But I'm imagining like a Donald Trump style candidate that that inflames passions on both sides. You really need to have disproportionate passions being raised for this to be a problem. If a lot of working class whites and a lot of Hispanics both get really exercised, it kind of cancels out. So you need the asymmetry in mobilization too, which is tougher to get, I think.
But I guess the concern is if the party could instruct voters not to
That's right.
vote for
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
But I don't know whether the parties can do that.
I mean, our system is rarely never that party centered. Our system is much more candidate centric than lots of other country systems. It's plausible, but unlikely, I think. Jonathan?
So sort of building on Lewis's and others' points, you might think also about what sort of information would be publicly available depending on the method you have for allocating credit. So if you get, a lifetime bank of credits, you can imagine gerrymandering based on who has a lot of credits remaining and who doesn't. And so you might think about concealing that information from the public. Or if you get some amount of credits at age 18 and then it gets renewed every several years, you might think about trying to conceal people's ages or something like that also, because that might be an indication as to how many credits they have left. And parties might try to redistrict based on those sorts of those pieces of information. So the information you publicly make available to the parties in the process of redistricting could tend to be sort of essential here.
Yeah, the general lesson here is that there are possibilities of a huge amount of strategic behavior that would have to be addressed, requiring further thought.
I don't think it has the formal good properties once people are strategically running candidates to absorb votes. So I think the technical results that say that quadratic voting is good don't apply when people can manipulate the agendas by running these candidates.
I agree. There'd have to be regulation, just as we have campaign regulations now to prevent manipulation of the current system. There would have to be ones as well.
Okay, question on the quadratic tax here. I like this idea. I'm curious if you've thought about the challenges. For example, suppose I want to give $100 to Hillary. I can either give her $100, which is equivalent in your system, or I can give $1 10 times. And I'm curious if you're going to have to pose, limitations. I mean, you can take that idea to infinity. Give small amounts of money that scale up.
Give $1 trillion.
Yeah. And so I'm curious if there's legal ramifications in limiting the number of times people can make contributions in QB, because people get paid differently.
Well, even now we'd have to track who's giving the money, but it would put more intensity on having to track small amounts, whereas we may not worry much about tracking small amounts right now.
Yeah, so is there a way to not break the system, which I love this idea?
I mean, I think it would have to be a one-time payment, right? Like, I think you're right. If you can break down your $100 contribution into, innumerable tiny contributions and therefore give, much more money, that's a big problem. So, like, I think to work, this would need the additional caveat that you have one shot at donating money to a given candidate in a given election. Yeah, I think it's a burden.
It's a problem under the current system because there are limits on donations, which you could try to get around by, having your own private companies that make additional contributions, or making contributions through friends who wouldn't otherwise do it, right? So you give money to a friend who wouldn't otherwise make a donation, and your friend gives that money to the candidate. So this is all illegal. And if you're caught, you can be sued. Dinesh D'Souza got caught, kind of the famous conservative public intellectual, and he went to jail, or he got in serious trouble because I think he paid someone to make a donation. So there are always going to be these ways of circumventing the regulation. But if the regulation itself is constitutional, then it certainly would be legal for additional laws to prevent circumvention.
And there are certain precedents also to having the treatment of contributions vary based on when exactly the contributions are given. So, in presidential primaries, only contributions given in certain windows and in certain amounts qualify for the matching funds from the federal government. Seattle recently adopted the country's first real voucher system for local elections. And there too, you can use the vouchers, in certain ways at certain times, not just whenever you feel like it. So none of those are exactly analogous to this kind of restriction, but they show that there is precedent, and it's widely considered to be constitutional to at least have some regulation of the time and the process of giving.